He was a rebel, a sinner, and a thinker centuries ahead of his time. From wild nights in Carthage to the quiet of a North African monastery, Augustine's journey reshaped faith, philosophy, and the very idea of a human soul. This is the story of the man who asked the questions we still can't stop asking. Aurelius Augustinus, known to history as Saint Augustine, was born in the year 354 in the small North African town of Thagaste, in what is now modern-day Algeria. He did not begin his life as a saint, nor even as a particularly devout Christian. His journey was long, conflicted, intellectual, and deeply human. To understand Augustine is to understand a man torn between desire and discipline, ambition and humility, philosophy and faith. His life became one of the most powerful spiritual transformations in Western history, and his writings would shape Christianity, philosophy, and political thought for more than 1,000 years. Augustine was born into a divided household. His mother, Monica, was a devoted Christian whose faith was intense and unwavering. His father, Patricius, was a pagan Roman official who valued status and advancement. From childhood, Augustine absorbed both influences. He inherited his mother's emotional depth and spiritual intensity, but also his father's ambition and attachment to worldly success. His early education focused on rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, which was the key to social mobility in the Roman world. Augustine excelled at it. He was brilliant, ambitious, and eager to rise. As a young man, he left Thagaste for Carthage, a major cultural center in Roman North Africa. There he immersed himself in study, pleasure, and intellectual exploration. He later described this period in his famous work Confessions with painful honesty. He wrote about his restless desires, his attraction to sensual pleasure, and his struggle with self-control. One of his most famous admissions was that as a youth he prayed for chastity, but not yet. This single line captures the inner tension that defined much of his early life. He wanted truth and goodness, but he also wanted immediate satisfaction. During this period, Augustine became attracted to Manichaeism, a religious movement that offered a dualistic explanation of the universe. Manichaeism taught that reality was divided between forces of light and darkness, good and evil. For nearly a decade, Augustine followed this teaching. It appealed to his intellectual curiosity and offered a simple explanation for the presence of evil in the world. Instead of seeing evil as a moral failing within the human will, Manichaeism treated it as a cosmic force. Yet over time, Augustine became dissatisfied. The answers that once seemed convincing began to feel shallow. The movement's leaders could not respond convincingly to his deeper philosophical questions. Seeking greater intellectual challenge and career advancement, Augustine traveled to Rome and later to Milan. In Milan, he encountered a man who would change his life, Bishop Ambrose. Ambrose was not only a religious leader, but also a powerful speaker and thinker. Augustine initially admired him for his rhetorical skill, but gradually, Ambrose's interpretation of Christian scripture began to dissolve Augustine's intellectual resistance. Christianity, which Augustine had once dismissed as simplistic, now appeared philosophically sophisticated. At the same time, Augustine encountered Neoplatonism, a philosophical system derived from Plato. Neoplatonism emphasized the idea of a single, ultimate source of reality, a perfect and transcendent good from which all existence flows. This philosophy helped Augustine rethink the problem of evil. Instead of seeing evil as a substance or cosmic force, he began to see it as a privation, a lack of good, much like darkness is the absence of light. This idea would become central to his theology. Despite these intellectual breakthroughs, Augustine still struggled emotionally. He was attached to worldly ambitions and to a long-term companion with whom he had a son named Adeodatus. When his career prospects required him to pursue a socially advantageous marriage, he reluctantly sent his companion away. This decision caused him deep anguish. His life felt divided between the pull of ambition and the call of spiritual surrender. The turning point came in 386 in a garden in Milan. Augustine later described sitting in despair, overwhelmed by his inability to commit fully to a life of faith. He heard what sounded like a child's voice saying, "Take and read." Interpreting this as a sign, he opened a nearby copy of the letters of Paul and read a passage urging believers to abandon indulgence and put on the life of Christ. In that moment, Augustine experienced what he described as a profound inner transformation. The long battle between his desires and his conscience seemed to resolve. Soon after, he was baptized by Ambrose. He abandoned his plans for a political career and returned to North Africa. His mother Monica, who had prayed for his conversion for years, died shortly after his baptism. Augustine would later write tenderly of her faith and perseverance. Back in Africa, Augustine initially sought a quiet monastic life devoted to prayer and study, but his intellectual gifts and spiritual intensity quickly drew attention. In 391, he was ordained as a priest in Hippo, a coastal city. A few years later, he became bishop. He would remain bishop of Hippo for the rest of his life. As bishop, Augustine was not a secluded mystic. He was a public intellectual, administrator, preacher, and controversialist. He wrote constantly, responding to theological disputes that threatened the unity of the church. One of his major battles was against the Donatists, a group that argued that clergy who had faltered under persecution could not validly administer sacraments. Augustine argued that the effectiveness of sacraments did not depend on the moral purity of the priest, but on the grace of God. Another major controversy involved Pelagianism. Pelagius taught that human beings could achieve righteousness through their own effort and free will. Augustine strongly opposed this view. Drawing from his own experience of inner struggle, he argued that human nature is deeply wounded by original sin and that divine grace is absolutely necessary for salvation. This doctrine of grace became one of his most influential and debated contributions to Christian theology. In 410, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. The once mighty city, symbol of imperial power, fell to foreign invaders. Many pagans blamed Christianity, claiming that abandoning the old gods had weakened the empire. In response, Augustine began writing his monumental work, The City of God. In this massive text, he argued that earthly empires rise and fall according to historical forces, but the true community of believers, the city of God, is eternal. He distinguished between the earthly city, driven by self-love and power, and the heavenly city, defined by love of God. This work reshaped Christian political thought by reframing history not as the story of Rome's glory, but as the unfolding drama of divine providence. Augustine died in 430 while Hippo was under siege by the Vandals. As the Roman world crumbled around him, he left behind a body of writing that would outlast empires. His Confessions became one of the first great autobiographical works in Western literature, exploring memory, desire, time, and the restless human heart. The opening line remains famous: "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." It captures the spiritual longing that defined his life. Augustine's influence extended into medieval theology, the Protestant Reformation, and modern philosophy. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and even secular philosophers engaged deeply with his ideas. His reflections on grace, free will, time, and the nature of evil continue to shape debates today. He began as a restless seeker, chasing ambition and pleasure. He became a bishop wrestling with heresy and political collapse. Through it all, he remained a man deeply aware of his own weakness and dependence on grace. Saint Augustine stands not merely as a theologian, but as a witness to inner transformation, intellectual courage, and the enduring search for truth. After his conversion and return to North Africa, Augustine did not immediately step into the role of a towering authority. He intended, at first, to withdraw from the noise of ambition and live a quiet life devoted to prayer, study, and philosophical reflection. He gathered a small community of like-minded men in Thagaste, forming what was essentially a Christian intellectual circle modeled partly on monastic ideals and partly on classical philosophical schools. They shared property, studied scripture, debated ideas, and sought spiritual discipline. Augustine believed that truth was best pursued in community, where dialogue sharpened understanding and humility guarded against pride. Yet his desire for relative obscurity did not last long. In 391, while visiting the city of Hippo Regius, he was unexpectedly chosen by the congregation to become a priest. The choice was not entirely voluntary. In that era, public acclamation often forced capable men into church leadership. Augustine wept when he realized his contemplative plans would be replaced by pastoral responsibility. As a priest, and later as Bishop of Hippo, Augustine entered a world of relentless demands. He preached regularly, often multiple times a week. His sermons were not abstract philosophical lectures, but practical, emotionally direct addresses aimed at ordinary believers. He spoke about forgiveness, humility, temptation, charity, and perseverance. At the same time, he carried heavy administrative burdens. He mediated disputes, advised civic authorities, cared for the poor, and managed church property. The Roman Empire in North Africa was unstable, and social tensions were constant. Augustine's bishopric was not a comfortable academic post. It was a frontline position in a society strained by economic inequality, religious division, and looming political collapse. One of the most exhausting conflicts of his career was with the Donatists. This movement had emerged after earlier Roman persecutions of Christians. Some clergy had handed over sacred texts to Roman officials under threat. The Donatists argued that such betrayal permanently disqualified those clergy from legitimate ministry. They insisted that the church must remain pure and that sacraments performed by compromised priests were invalid. Augustine opposed them firmly, but with complex reasoning. He argued that the church on earth is a mixed body of saints and sinners. Absolute purity, he said, would not be achieved in this life. What makes a sacrament effective is not the moral perfection of the priest, but the grace of God working through the church. This theological position had far-reaching implications. It strengthened institutional unity and discouraged fragmentation. Yet it also led Augustine to support, reluctantly, the use of state power to suppress Donatist violence when conflicts escalated. This remains one of the more controversial aspects of his legacy, as he struggled to balance compassion with order. Even more influential was his confrontation with Pelagianism. Pelagius, a British monk, taught that human beings possess full moral freedom and can obey God's commands without special divine intervention. He denied that humanity inherited a fallen nature from Adam. Augustine reacted strongly against this view because it clashed with his own experience. He believed that human beings are deeply inclined towards selfishness and cannot achieve righteousness purely through willpower. Drawing from both scripture and introspection, he developed a doctrine of original sin, arguing that humanity shares in a wounded condition passed down from its earliest origins. For Augustine, grace was not merely helpful, but absolutely necessary. Without divine assistance, the human will remain trapped in disordered love. This emphasis on grace shaped Western Christianity profoundly, influencing centuries of theological debate and later becoming central to the Protestant Reformation. While Augustine fought these doctrinal battles, the Roman world around him trembled. In 410, when news reached North Africa that Rome had been sacked by the Visigoths, shockwaves spread across the empire. Rome had stood for centuries as the symbol of order, civilization, and invincibility. Its fall seemed unimaginable. Pagans accused Christians of weakening the empire by abandoning the old gods. Many Christians themselves were shaken, wondering whether history was unraveling. Augustine responded not with panic, but with one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in Christian history. He began writing the City of God, a massive work that would take him more than a decade to complete. In the City of God, Augustine reframed the entire meaning of history. He argued that no earthly empire, not even Rome at its height, was eternal. Political powers rise and fall according to temporal conditions. To place ultimate hope in any state is to misunderstand the nature of reality. Augustine described two symbolic cities: the earthly city, built on self-love and domination, and the city of God, built on love of God and self-giving humility. These two cities are interwoven throughout history, not separated geographically, but spiritually. Every human life, every society participates in one orientation or the other. This vision allowed Augustine to interpret Rome's fall not as the collapse of divine order, but as another episode in a long and complex narrative guided by providence. Augustine also reflected deeply on time itself. In Confessions, he asked what time truly is. He observed that the past no longer exists, the future does not yet exist, and the present seems to vanish as soon as we attempt to grasp it. Yet human beings experience memory, anticipation, and attention. He concluded that time is experienced within the soul. The mind stretches across memory of the past, awareness of the present, and expectation of the future. This introspective analysis was revolutionary. It anticipated later philosophical explorations of consciousness and subjective experience. Augustine's reflections on time reveal how his thought moved beyond theology into profound philosophical territory. Throughout his later years, Augustine remained intensely aware of his own imperfections. Near the end of his life, he wrote a work called Retractations, in which he reviewed his earlier writings and corrected what he believed were mistakes or imprecise statements. This act demonstrated humility and intellectual honesty. He did not claim infallibility. He saw himself as a pilgrim still learning, even after decades of leadership. As the Vandals advanced into North Africa, laying siege to cities and dismantling Roman authority, Augustine stayed in Hippo. He did not flee. During the siege of 430, weakened by illness, he spent his final days in prayer and reflection. According to later accounts, penitential psalms were written on the walls of his room so he could meditate on them as he lay dying. When he passed away, the empire that had framed his entire life was disintegrating. Yet his intellectual and spiritual legacy was only beginning to expand. Augustine's thought would shape medieval theology, influence debates about church and state, inspire reformers, and provoke philosophers for centuries. His exploration of inner conflict, grace, time, and history gave Western civilization some of its most enduring categories of thought. He began as a restless young man driven by ambition and desire. He became a bishop wrestling with heresy, empire, and a fragile human heart. In every stage of his life, one theme remained constant: the search for a love strong enough to bring rest to the restless soul. As Augustine's reputation expanded beyond Hippo, his influence began to stretch across the entire Latin Christian world. Letters arrived from bishops, monks, scholars, and ordinary believers seeking clarity on questions that touched both the soul and society. He responded tirelessly. His study became a place of constant intellectual labor, filled with manuscripts, correspondence, and drafts. Yet he never wrote merely to display brilliance. His writing was always anchored in lived struggle. The same man who once wrestled with desire in the streets of Carthage now wrestled with theological controversy in the fragile remains of the Roman Empire. One of his most enduring contributions during these years was his deepening reflection on love. Augustine became convinced that love is the driving force behind every human action. No one acts without loving something. The true question is not whether we love, but what we love most. When wealth, power, pleasure, or pride occupy the highest place in the heart, life becomes disordered. Anxiety, rivalry, and violence follow. But when love is directed first toward God, other loves find their proper proportion. Family, friendship, work, and even political responsibility become meaningful without becoming idols. Augustine described this as the right ordering of love, a concept that would quietly shape Christian ethics for centuries. His thought on human freedom also matured during this period. Critics argued that his emphasis on grace left little room for free will. Augustine responded by carefully distinguishing between freedom as mere choice and freedom as the ability to choose the good. After humanity's fall into sin, he argued, the will remains active but weakened, inclined towards selfish desire. Grace does not eliminate the will, it heals it. Only when the heart is transformed can it genuinely delight in what is good. This view preserved both divine initiative and human responsibility, though debate over his conclusions would echo through medieval theology and into the Reformation many centuries later. Augustine's reflections were not limited to personal salvation. He turned his attention to the structure of society itself. As violence and instability increased across the empire, he considered the moral complexity of political authority. He acknowledged that governments, even flawed ones, serve a purpose in restraining chaos. In a world marked by disordered love, force might sometimes be necessary to prevent greater injustice. Yet he insisted that war and coercion must always aim at restoring peace, never at glorifying domination. This tension between realism and moral aspiration laid early groundwork for later ideas about just war and the limits of political power. At the same time, Augustine continued to probe the depths of the human interior. His exploration of memory remains one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient thought. He described memory as a vast inner field, filled with images, emotions, knowledge, and experiences layered upon one another. Entering memory was, for him, like entering a great palace within the soul. There he encountered not only past events, but the mystery of self-awareness itself. How could the mind hold so much? How could it search itself? In asking these questions, Augustine pushed philosophy inward. The journey to truth was not only outward toward the world, but inward toward the depths of consciousness. He also reflected on time in ways that continue to fascinate philosophers. The past, he observed, no longer exists. The future does not yet exist. The present slips away the moment we attempt to grasp it. Yet human beings live constantly within memory, attention, and expectation. Time, he concluded, is experienced within the soul as a stretching between what has been and what will be. This insight moved beyond theology into profound metaphysical reflection. It revealed a thinker who was not only defending doctrine, but exploring the structure of human experience itself. As the Western Roman Empire weakened further, Augustine's writings in the City of God continued to circulate. He insisted that no earthly empire could serve as the ultimate object of hope. Political systems, however impressive, remain temporary arrangements shaped by flawed human love. The true and lasting community is defined not by borders or armies, but by orientation of the heart. This vision allowed Christians to endure the collapse of Roman power without collapsing spiritually. Their identity did not depend on imperial stability. In his later years, Augustine demonstrated remarkable intellectual humility. He composed a work reviewing his earlier writings, correcting errors, and clarifying arguments. This act revealed a rare willingness to admit growth and limitation. He did not present himself as a flawless authority. He saw himself as a pilgrim still learning, still refining his understanding of divine truth. Meanwhile, the external world grew darker. The Vandals advanced steadily across North Africa. Towns fell. Trade routes broke down. Fear spread among the population. Hippo itself came under siege. Augustine was now an elderly bishop watching the structures of his youth dissolve. Yet he did not abandon his post. He continued preaching, encouraging believers to anchor their hope beyond political turmoil. For him, the collapse of empire confirmed what he had long argued. Earthly power is fragile. As illness overtook him during the siege, Augustine withdrew into prayer. He requested that penitential psalms be placed before him so he could meditate on them in his final days. His life, marked by restless searching, intellectual brilliance, controversy, and pastoral care, ended not in public triumph, but in quiet reflection. Around him, the Roman world was transforming irreversibly, but the ideas he had forged would travel far beyond the walls of Hippo. Augustine's influence would shape medieval theology, inform debates about grace and freedom, inspire reformers, and challenge philosophers exploring memory, time, and consciousness. He began life chasing ambition and pleasure. He ended it as a bishop who understood that the deepest battle is not political, but spiritual. His enduring insight was that the human heart is defined by what it loves, and until that love finds its highest object, it remains unsettled. In tracing that restless journey with unsparing honesty, Augustine left behind not merely doctrine, but a map of the human soul. When Augustine died in the year 430, the Roman world he had known since childhood was dissolving. The Vandals continued their conquest of North Africa. Imperial authority was fragmenting, and the confidence that had once defined Roman civilization was fading into uncertainty. Yet while political structures collapsed, Augustine's intellectual and spiritual architecture was only beginning to take permanent shape. His influence would not be confined to his lifetime, nor to the borders of the empire. It would expand quietly, steadily, across centuries. In the generations that followed, monasteries became centers for preserving learning, and Augustine's works were copied again and again by hand. His Confessions became one of the most widely read texts in Christian history, not only because it defended doctrine, but because it revealed a soul in motion. He did something rare for the ancient world. He wrote about himself with radical honesty. He admitted pride, lust, ambition, confusion, grief, and weakness. He traced the inner logic of his own transformation. In doing so, he helped create a new kind of literature, one where the interior life mattered as much as public action. This introspective tradition would later influence medieval mystics, Renaissance humanists, and even modern writers exploring psychological depth. Theologically, his doctrine of grace became foundational. Medieval thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas engaged deeply with his work, sometimes refining it, sometimes expanding it, but never ignoring it. During the 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation erupted across Europe, both Martin Luther and John Calvin drew heavily from Augustine's writings on sin and grace. In many ways, the debates that fractured Western Christianity were echoes of arguments Augustine had articulated 1,000 years earlier. His insistence that salvation is rooted in divine initiative rather than human merit became a central pillar of Reformed theology. Even outside explicitly religious contexts, Augustine's ideas shaped Western philosophy. His exploration of time influenced later thinkers who grappled with memory and consciousness. His reflections on the will and moral responsibility anticipated psychological and ethical debates that would not fully develop until centuries later. His concept of the two cities, the earthly and the divine, laid groundwork for later discussions about the separation of church and state and the limits of political authority. By distinguishing ultimate loyalty to God from allegiance to empire, he helped establish a framework in which political power could be critiqued rather than worshipped. Augustine's legacy, however, is not without tension. Some have criticized his strong emphasis on original sin, arguing that it casts too dark a shadow over human potential. Others have questioned his support for using state power in certain religious disputes, seeing in it a precedent for later coercion. These debates reflect the complexity of his thought. He was not writing in a stable or ideal world. He was responding to crisis, fragmentation, and moral uncertainty. His conclusions were forged in the pressure of historical upheaval. What remains striking is the consistency of his central theme. From his restless youth in Carthage to his final days in besieged Hippo, Augustine returned again and again to the question of love. What do we love most deeply? What governs our desires? What anchors our hope? For him, every moral failure could be traced to misdirected love, and every genuine transformation began with reordering the heart. This vision gave coherence to his theology, his philosophy, and his understanding of history. He believed that history itself is not random chaos, but a meaningful narrative moving toward fulfillment. Empires rise and fall. Cultures flourish and decay. But beneath these visible movements lies a deeper drama concerning the orientation of human souls. The city of God is not a political structure, but a community defined by its love. This idea allowed Augustine to interpret catastrophe without despair. Even as Rome's power crumbled, he saw a larger story unfolding. Centuries later, his voice still speaks because it addresses something universal. The tension between ambition and humility, desire and discipline, freedom and dependence, remains part of the human condition. Augustine did not present himself as someone who escaped that tension effortlessly. He described it as a lifelong struggle. His honesty makes his conclusions more compelling. He knew the pull of pride. He knew the lure of pleasure. He knew the temptation to seek security in worldly success. And he concluded, after years of searching, that lasting peace cannot be found in any of these. Saint Augustine began life as a brilliant and ambitious young man seeking recognition in the Roman world. He ended it as a bishop reflecting on eternity while his earthly surroundings fell apart. Between those 2 points lies a journey of intellectual depth and spiritual transformation that reshaped Western thought. His writings became bridges between classical philosophy and Christian theology, between ancient rhetoric and medieval reflection, between political collapse and enduring hope. He left no empire behind him, no army, no monument of stone. What he left were words, words that examined the soul with precision, words that wrestled with grace and freedom, words that reframed history itself. In a world still wrestling with identity, power, morality, and longing, Augustine's voice continues to remind us that the deepest battles are not fought in palaces or on battlefields, but within the human heart.